Hayward Fault. The fault scientists fear more than San Andreas, and it's overdue. The crack runs through the middle of the stadium. At Memorial Stadium on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, the Hayward Fault passes directly beneath the field and through the concrete structure of the eastern grandstand. The fault doesn't hide. It moves. At roughly 4 to 6 millimeters per year, the ground on one side slides past the other in a process called creep. Slow enough to go unnoticed on any given day, fast enough to have offset the stadium's foundation in ways that are now measurably visible in the structure itself. The crack is not a metaphor. The movement is not a projection. And the accumulated strain that creep does not release, decades of stress building in the deeper rock, waiting to discharge in seconds, is also not theoretical. The Hayward Fault has a documented history, a measured recurrence interval, and a precise geographic address. It runs through the center of one of the most densely urbanized corridors in the United States, and by every calculation in the scientific record, it is overdue. That word, overdue, has a specific meaning here. It does not mean a countdown. It means that the interval between major ruptures on this fault has, on average, already passed. The last rupture has a date, October 21st, 1868. At approximately 7:53 in the morning, a rupture along the Hayward Fault released what seismologists later estimated as a magnitude 6.8 earthquake. The shaking lasted less than a minute. In the town of Haywards, the settlement that would eventually become the city of Hayward, the destruction was close to total. Brick buildings fell into the streets, chimneys collapsed through rooftops. The ground fractured along a visible surface trace that extended for miles through the low hills east of San Francisco Bay. The shaking was felt across a corridor spanning from Marysville in the north to Santa Barbara in the south, more than 500 miles. At least 30 people died. The actual number was likely higher. Record-keeping in rural communities was inconsistent, and not every death produced a documented account that survived into the following century. Newspapers in San Francisco called it the Great San Francisco Earthquake. In 1868, the name was accurate. Nothing larger had struck the region within living memory. The fault responsible had, in a single morning, produced the most destructive earthquake California had ever recorded. 38 years later, the name was reassigned. On April 18, 1906, the San Andreas Fault ruptured along nearly 300 miles of California coastline. The estimated magnitude was 7.9. The fires that followed burned for 3 days across San Francisco. The death toll, never fully resolved, fell somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 people. The event became the California earthquake, the fixed reference point against which every subsequent rupture in the state would be measured and found smaller. The 1868 Hayward earthquake did not disappear from the geological record. It disappeared from the cultural one. Within a generation, it had been reduced to a historical footnote, an earlier event, a smaller event, something that happened before the real catastrophe arrived. The fault itself was treated accordingly. It received less sustained scientific attention than the fault that had replaced it in public memory. What that compression obscured was the interval. The Hayward Fault had ruptured before 1868. The evidence was already written in the ground. Offset stream channels, displaced sediment layers, compressed organic material that marked each major rupture the way a stratigraphic column marks each shift in climate. Reading that evidence required instruments and methods that did not yet exist. When they were developed, the pattern they revealed was consistent across multiple independent sites along the fault. The fault had moved before 1868. It would move again after it. The only information the physical record could not supply was the precise moment when. The science of reading past earthquakes from sediment is called paleoseismology, and along the Hayward Fault, it produced results that would fundamentally revise the regional risk picture. The method works by excavating trenches across the fault trace, cuts deep enough to expose the layered sediment that accumulated over centuries. Each major earthquake leaves a signature in those layers, a sudden offset between strata that were once continuous, a collapse of material into fissures that opened at the surface, a disturbed horizon of organic matter that radiocarbon analysis can date with precision. When multiple sites along the same fault produce the same horizon at the same date, the rupture event is confirmed. James Lean Kemper, a geologist with the United States Geological Survey, led paleoseismic investigations along the Hayward Fault through the 1990s and 2000s. Trench sites in Fremont, Hayward, and other points along the fault's southern segment produced consistent results across independent locations. The record identified major ruptures predating 1868 and yielded intervals between them that could be measured and compared. The data pointed to a mean recurrence interval of approximately 140 to 160 years. Individual intervals varied. Earthquake recurrence is stochastic, not mechanically periodic. But the distribution was consistent enough to place 1868 clearly within a repeating sequence. More than 150 years have now passed since that rupture. Overdue in this context is not rhetorical. It means the elapsed time has met or exceeded the historical average interval, and that conditional rupture probability increases as the gap extends. The 2008 Working Group on California Earthquake Probabilities assigned a 31% chance of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake on the Hayward-Rogers Creek Fault system within 30 years. The 2014 UCRF3 assessment, the most comprehensive rupture forecast California had produced, kept the Hayward-Rogers Creek system among the highest probability sources in the state, with the northern Hayward segment alone carrying a 21% conditional probability over 30 years. The fault is accumulating strain at a known rate, along a structure whose history has been read from the ground with precision. The one number the sediment cannot supply is the only one still missing from the calculation. The Hayward Fault is not a unique case. Faults with long intervals, dense urban exposure, and documented histories are found on every tectonically active continent, and most of them are studied far less. This channel maps those records, fault by fault, where the physical evidence leads. Subscribe. The San Andreas Fault runs along the western edge of the San Francisco Peninsula, through the Coast Ranges and along the coastline. In the Bay Area, much of its trace crosses terrain that was, in 1906, largely uninhabited. Hills, open valleys, and coastal land that the rupture passed through before reaching the built environment. The destruction it caused in San Francisco resulted primarily from secondary effects: fire, liquefaction, and the collapse of unreinforced masonry in a city partially built on unstable fill. The Hayward Fault does not run through open terrain. It runs through the cities. From its southern end near Fremont, the fault traces northward along the base of the East Bay Hills for approximately 74 miles, passing through Union City, Hayward, San Leandro, Oakland, Berkeley, and El Chorrito before continuing toward San Pablo Bay. The cities did not grow near the fault. They grew over it, and in many cases, directly on top of the surface trace itself. The fault's path is not difficult to locate. In Hayward, decades of lateral offset have visibly displaced street curbs and sidewalk segments. In Berkeley, the fault passes beneath the campus of the University of California, through Memorial Stadium, past Haviland Hall, under the Botanical Garden. In Oakland, the trace runs through dense residential neighborhoods before continuing north. The fault line on a map and the existing urban grid are not parallel features. In the East Bay, they are the same terrain. Complicating the picture further is the creep already visible at the stadium. The Hayward Fault moves between large earthquakes at an average rate of roughly 4 to 6 millimeters per year along certain segments. This slow, continuous motion is sometimes read as a form of pressure release, evidence that strain is dissipating gradually rather than accumulating for a single large rupture. That interpretation does not hold against the data. Research on creeping fault segments has established that surface creep and deep seismic locking are not mutually exclusive. The movement observable in displaced curbs reflects motion in the shallow crust. Below that level, stress continues to accumulate across a locked interface that surface creep cannot reach. When that interface ruptures, the preceding decades of millimeter-scale movement become irrelevant to what propagates upward. The Hayward Fault creeps at the surface and locks at depth. Both conditions exist simultaneously. One describes the present state of the fault. The other describes what that state is building toward. In 1868, the fault ruptured through a landscape of scattered ranches, a small commercial district, and farmland. The East Bay population numbered in the tens of thousands. The infrastructure at risk consisted of wooden construction and unpaved roads. The terrain the fault runs through today is categorically different. The East Bay Municipal Utility District supplies water to approximately 1.4 million people across a service area. The Hayward Fault bisects at multiple points. Its transmission network, tunnels, pipelines, and treatment facilities built over decades crosses the fault trace at several locations. The Claremont Tunnel, a major water conveyance structure through the Berkeley Hills, was identified early as a critical vulnerability. EBMUD has invested in flexible joint systems designed to accommodate fault displacement without total pipeline failure. Those upgrades carry an embedded acknowledgement. The pipes will move when the fault ruptures. The engineering addresses how much of that movement the system can absorb before it fails completely. Hospitals present a distinct category of problem. Several medical facilities in the East Bay corridor sit on or near the fault trace. In a post-rupture environment, roads damaged, water pressure compromised, emergency calls running simultaneously across a population of millions, the operational condition of each hospital determines who receives care within the critical first 48 hours. A facility that has lost structural integrity, backup power, or water supply in the same event that generated its casualties is not a resource. It is an additional problem. Schools in the corridor range from modern construction, built to current seismic codes, to older structures that predate California's Field Act standards. The Field Act, enacted after the 1933 Long Beach earthquake, imposed strict seismic requirements on new school construction, not retroactively on buildings already standing. The road network adds a further dimension. Interstate 580 and Interstate 880 run through the East Bay, parallel to or across sections of the fault zone. In 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake, centered roughly 60 miles south of Oakland on a separate fault, caused a section of the Cypress Street Viaduct on I-880 to collapse, killing 42 people in seconds. A Hayward rupture would originate directly beneath the urban corridor, not at distance from it. The inventory is specific. The pipelines have addresses. The hospitals have names. The fault trace has been mapped through individual city blocks. The 2018 Hayward scenario, a USGS-led research project, was constructed precisely to assess this infrastructure, not whether it would be affected by a major rupture, but in what sequence it would fail, and at what cost. The Hayward earthquake scenario was published by the United States Geological Survey in 2018. It is not a prediction. It is a consequence model, a methodical attempt to trace what happens to a specific region in a specific sequence when a known fault ruptures in a way consistent with its documented history. The scenario initiates at 4:18 in the morning on April 18th, the anniversary of the 1906 earthquake. A magnitude 7.0 rupture begins on the Hayward Fault in the northern East Bay and propagates southward along the trace. The timing is deliberate. 4:18 a.m. represents minimum street occupancy and maximum indoor shelter. It is a baseline, not an optimistic case, but the lowest point on a range of tolls that rises sharply as the hour changes. The projected direct toll, hundreds of deaths, and approximately 18,000 injuries requiring emergency medical treatment. The figure that shifted the researchers' attention was not the initial count. It was what the water system's failure would trigger next. Within the first hours of the rupture, an estimated 400 fires ignite across the affected area. Broken gas lines and disrupted electrical infrastructure create ignition sources faster than suppression resources can respond. In 1906, most of San Francisco's destruction came not from the shaking, but from the fires the shaking started. Hayward projected the same dynamic, with the water transmission system in the same fractured condition it was in 1906, and a population several times larger depending on it. Fire following earthquake was modeled as a potential dominant source of loss, exceeding the direct damage from ground motion itself. Displaced households were estimated at approximately 22,000 in the immediate aftermath. Economic losses from shaking alone were projected in the range of $80 billion, before accounting for fire damage, utility disruption, and protracted recovery across one of the highest output regional economies in the country. What the scenario established beyond any single projected figure was the order of failure. The fault breaks. The water transmission network fractures at fault crossings. Fires ignite across a corridor where pressure-dependent hydrants cannot function. Hospitals still operational receive patients from an area where access roads are partially blocked. Each failure generates the condition for the next. The scenario was built to identify where those chains could be interrupted before the fault provides the first link. California's seismic knowledge base today is categorically different from what existed in 1868. The instruments are different. The legal framework is different. The engineering standards are different. And the gap between what is now known and what has been done with that knowledge is one of the persistent features of the regional risk picture. The Alquist-Priolo Earthquake Fault Zone Act, passed in 1972 following the 1971 San Fernando earthquake, prohibits new construction of structures for human occupancy directly on active fault traces. Properties within designated fault zones require disclosure to buyers. The law formalized what the science had already established. Building on an active surface rupture zone is a categorically different risk from building near one. What the Alquist-Priolo Act could not address was the building stock that already existed along the Hayward Fault when it was passed, or the structures built before its provisions reached full enforcement. The Bay Bridge's eastern span was replaced after 1989, with the new structure opening in 2013. California's Highway Bridge Retrofit Program, accelerated after Loma Prieta, exposed critical vulnerabilities in elevated freeway design, addressed thousands of structures statewide. EBMUD's Seismic Improvement Program has been installing flexible couplings at fault crossings, engineering designed to allow pipes to flex through limited displacement without complete failure. California also operates Shake Alert, a USGS-developed early warning system that detects initial seismic waves and transmits alerts before the more destructive shaking arrives. Depending on distance from the fault, those alerts can provide seconds to tens of seconds, enough to trigger automated system shutdowns, slow trains, and prompt people to take cover. What none of these measures has changed is the existing building inventory. Hundreds of thousands of structures in the East Bay were built before current seismic codes existed. Unreinforced masonry buildings, the same construction type that collapsed in 1868 and 1906, remain in use across the corridor. Non-ductile concrete structures, which lack the reinforcement needed to flex rather than fracture under lateral loading, represent another documented category of risk. Retrofit programs exist. Mandates vary by jurisdiction. Progress is real. It has not reached completion. The population living within the Hayward Fault corridor is larger today than at any point in the region's recorded history. The infrastructure is more interconnected. The scientific record of the fault is more detailed than it has ever been. The interval between what the data describes and what the built environment reflects remains the open variable, and the fault does not adjust its timeline to the pace of construction. The sediment record along the Hayward Fault does not contain a prediction. It contains a pattern, a sequence of ruptures separated by intervals, each one documented in displaced strata and offset organic horizons that radiocarbon analysis can date to within decades. The pattern does not instruct the fault when to move. It tells the researchers reading it that the fault has moved before, repeatedly, at intervals that have now elapsed. That is the full extent of what the science can confirm. The magnitude of the next rupture, the precise initiation point, the direction of propagation, the hour, none of these are recoverable from the record. What is recoverable is the structural character of the fault, its length, its locked depth, its creep rate at the surface, its relationship to the Rogers Creek Fault to the north, which shares its seismic history and extends the zone of concern deeper into the North Bay. The cities along the Hayward Fault trace were not all built in ignorance of what lay beneath them. Some structures now standing on the surface trace were built before the fault's exact position had been mapped in detail. Others were built after the mapping existed, but before the legal framework restricted construction on active traces. Others still are products of development pressure, economic calculation, and the compounding difficulty of applying probabilistic risk to decisions made at human scale. A building permit, a purchase, a zoning variance, rather than at the scale of a regional system. Memorial Stadium at UC Berkeley sits where it has always sat. The crack in its eastern grandstand marks the same fault that fractured the ground in 1868 and in the ruptures before that. The stadium has been retrofitted. The crack remains, not as a structural failure, but as a record of continuous movement. The fault passes through the foundation and continues north through Berkeley, through Oakland, through cities that grew along its trace without knowing, and then with knowing, that the ground beneath them holds a loaded interval. The Hayward scenario, the Paleoseismic trench records, the USGS probability assessments, and the ongoing infrastructure audits do not resolve the central uncertainty. They produce an inventory. That inventory is detailed enough to act on, and has been detailed enough to act on for decades. The progress made since 1989 is real and documented. The gap between that progress and what the scenario projects is also real and documented. The crack in the eastern grandstand of Memorial Stadium is still there. The retrofit addressed the structure. It did not address the fault. The ground beneath the stadium moves 4 to 6 millimeters per year, in the same direction, at the same rate that it has been moving since the last major rupture opened the ground in 1868. It does not wait for the retrofit schedule. It does not wait for the infrastructure audit. It moves at the pace of the tectonic plates, and it carries every structure built across its trace, visibly, measurably, continuously, toward the next threshold the sediment record says has been reached before.